if you love birds, if you love mammals, if you love bugs, if you love ferns, if you love trees, like whatever it is that you love, if you're into forests, then like this is the species for you. Because if we look after them, we're looking after all.
Well, y'all, it is my distinct honor to welcome in Dr. Kidda Ashman with us today. She is from World Wildlife Australia, and our first ever guest from Australia to talk all things conservation about sugar gliders. Her official position is the climate adaptation ecologist at World Wildlife Australia's Threatened Species Center. Kidda, how are you doing today? How has your day been so far? Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's been a good day. I am calling in from Melbourne, which is the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. So it's quite gloomy, a little bit moody here, grey skies, which is my preferred weather. I'm definitely a cold weather person. So it's been quite good. I have some ducks and chickens, and like as soon as the weather starts to get a bit drizzly and rainy, my ducks just go wild. So it's been good. It's been a nice morning.
Today for us is the first hot day where it's like we even have to turn on the air conditioning. So I feel like we're
Wow.
very oppositing on
Yes.
today's side of things. So,
Yeah.
Kidda, you are a conservation researcher in Australia working on primarily sugar gliders. Could you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in that field and how did you like end up pursuing that particular animal where it's like, you know what, this is the little guy that I'm gonna be studying, the greater glider, and I'm gonna be looking into it and this is gonna be my jam.
Yeah, it's like the origin story is like long and convoluted and many like pitfalls along the way. I feel like that's most people's experience, but I started out doing my undergrad on wildlife and conservation biology. Initially, I like finished up my like high school studies and was like, cool, I know I want to do like science and medicine, thought I wanted to become like a human doctor, and then pretty quickly realized humans were not it for me. So I was like, went a little bit of traveling and then did my undergrad in wildlife and conservation biology, and then went on to do an honors degree in evolutionary biology. So looking at moth evolutionary traits, and that was really cool. But I kind of quickly identified that in the research space, I really wanted to do stuff that was more applied and had more kind of real world focus where I felt like I could create an impact and make a difference. So my PhD focused on koalas in a part of Australia where they're dealing with habitat destruction and plantation establishment. So I actually studied koalas for my PhD. That was about 3 years. And then after my PhD, I ended up in a lab group at Australian National University studying a range of different species. So doing biodiversity kind of surveys across a part of Australia that has the world's tallest flowering plant, mountain ash. And greater gliders were one of the species that I started studying at that time. And then I moved to WWF Australia 6 years ago. You guys probably remember that summer we had the devastating bushfires that were just all up and down the East Coast. So at that time, we knew greater gliders were in a lot of trouble. And that became much more of a focus come kind of that 2020 kind of period. So we started doing a lot more work on habitat restoration, trying to basically throw them a bit of a lifeline when we knew they were in a lot of trouble. And since then, they've just become a really great flagship species. You think of them a little bit like a canary in the coal mine for forests. They're one of those species that start to kind of drop out quite early on when we start to see impacts in forests. So yeah, I think what got me interested in them initially, they're just like a little bit of a like cryptic kind of species that you don't see super often. So when you see them, it's really exciting. And they're incredibly cute. Like they look like Australia's own like Pokemon. Like they've got these massive ears and they glide, and they're just a really cool animal that is kind of otherwise like a bit mysterious. I'm always like I kind of feel like there's a healthy tension between people who work on koalas and people who work on greater gliders and other gliding species. And we're always like ripping each other a little bit about like which one's cuter. And I'm kind of always team underdog. So I feel like greater gliders are definitely like, yeah, that have really kind of, it's been a beautiful transition from working on koalas to gliders.
And you have experience that in both, so you're the one who can comment on which one's cuter.
This is usually my argument to them, but like they don't always listen. So
I have a probably a very basic question for you. So you mentioned that they're, this kind of this cryptic species that they're hard to find for the greater gliders. I guess number one is, are they nocturnal? So when you're doing these surveys and looking for them, are you also going against the lack of light? And then because they're so hard to find, how did we know that they were in trouble? And how do you know when your efforts are making a difference, right? Like that seems like a really big challenge when working with these animals.
yeah, great questions. Definitely not overly basic. So your first question, they are nocturnal. So that always makes it much more challenging to find them. They also don't vocalize. So we have other glider species like yellow belly gliders or sugar gliders that have this call that's like if you're out in the forest, you hear it. And you can do surveys like audio surveys and call playback surveys where you play a sound and they'll like return call to the sound. Greater gliders don't do that. So not only are you out in the forest at night, like trying to find a needle in a haystack, basically, because they're a relatively rare species, but they also, other than actually like seeing them with your torch or seeing them through like thermal imaging, there's like not really many other cues to like where they are. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the cryptic front. But in terms of like how did we know that they're in trouble? A few reasons really. So not only are they nocturnal, but they are also arboreal and folivorous. So arboreal meaning they depend on trees. They live their whole lives exclusively in trees and particularly in eucalypt trees. They also live in tree hollows and folivorous, meaning similar to koalas, they only eat eucalypt leaves. So they have a really quite a small niche as far as their habitat requirements go. And the 2019-2020 bushfires that burnt a really large proportion of what we already understood was their habitat. So, just based on the fire footprint and where previous records of greater gliders were, we were like, okay, like this is bad news for this species. Like, we're talking close to 30% of the entire range of the species had been burnt and burnt pretty badly and the same amount of their records. Like every single record that we've ever recorded of this species, close to 30% of them were wiped out in terms of where that fire footprint even was. Um, so we knew pretty quickly that they were going to be in trouble from these bushfires. And that was also like, this is a bit of a side note, side quest that we can pick up later on. But at that time, we were recognizing them just as a single species. They've since been reclassified taxonomically to at least two species. And the science, the more genetic analysis that we do, it's suggesting that there's probably at least three and maybe even up to five different species. So we were kind of simplistically looking at it post bushfire, going like, these guys are in trouble, and not really knowing that like these guys were actually like at least two guys and probably more guys. Um, and so immediately after that, like our response was basically like, what can we do to throw them some lifelines, given how much they've been impacted by these bushfires and how much they're continuing to be impacted by climate change and habitat destruction. So we kind of take a bit of a two-pronged effect with habitat protection and habitat restoration. So the protection looks like a lot of the advocacy stuff that we do and trying to work on policy and legislation to get kind of protection for their habitats. And then the restoration side of things is really around like nest boxes, because a lot of the time trees are not old enough to form hollows that are big enough for these guys to kind of move into. Because that process can take in Australian forests, it can take, at least 100 years or more to form a tree hollow that's big enough to house a greater glider. And so after the bushfires, when a lot of trees were impacted by fire and after, like land clearing and logging and things like that, forests remain young for a really long time. So we went and put nest boxes out. And this is a very long-winded way of getting to your third question, which is how do we know it's been successful? Um, so we did some post-bushfire monitoring. We basically went out and did a whole bunch of surveys and just established some baselines to be like, okay, what's the actual situation on the ground? What is the occupancy looking like? How many are out there? What's the abundance looking like? And so we established those baselines for what we were seeing on the ground. And then at half of our sites, we went in and put nest boxes out. And at the other half of our sites, we didn't put nest boxes out. So that's kind of like giving us a bit of a before and after control impact design to how we go in and do those restoration efforts. And then we monitor all of the sites through time. So we look at how are they recovering in the sites that we didn't put nest boxes in? How are they recovering in the sites that we did put nest boxes in? And comparing between the two to try to basically get a bit of a sense for if we did nothing, what would it be looking like today? Given that we did something in these sites, like what did that achieve? Um, and so through kind of monitoring through time, their occupancy, like basically what are the factors associated with whether or not they're at the sites and their abundance, how many are at the sites, that can give us a bit of a sense for if what we did had an impact.
It almost sounds like a clinical trial in a way, right? Where you're giving one group the standard or nothing, right? And then the experimental
Yeah,
drug, and you're seeing if there was a positive impact that happens. Are they
correct.
are they difficult to work with also just because of their diet, right? Because we've read and heard that eucalyptus is, processed slowly, and the one thing with koalas is that it takes so long to digest the material. Is that also a factor that you're dealing with the greater gliders?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, all the same kind of range of factors. Gliders are a lot smaller than koalas, so they're not dealing with like as much of that like koalas and gliders are effectively eating something that's toxic to them. Like it's an evolutionary muck up where they're basically like, oh, whoopsie, we've evolved to only eat this thing that's actually toxic to us. So that's not great for them. But they found a way to make it work. And there's that constant evolutionary arms race where like plants change their toxicity and change how they're toxic. And then the animals kind of catch up and evolve. And they seem to make it work, but it's definitely the same kind of situation with koalas and gliders where they're constantly finding ways to process that toxicity, and that's part of why we think like gliding and things like that has been like a trait that's evolved through time. Is that whilst they don't glide super often, it allows them to move larger distances more rapidly in a relatively energy efficient way. And so koalas who don't glide, who don't have those gliding membranes and stuff, they typically live a fairly sedentary life. Having said that, in my time when I was radio tracking koalas, like they can move. I've had ones like really give me the runaround. So, it's like there's always an exception to the rule, right?
I love that. Is there so like we mentioned that let's just assume that the koalas are a little bit more sedentary, right? At least more than the sugar
Yeah.
glider or the greater glider. Is there ever competition between the two species within this a given habitat for that diet? And if so, how do you balance that, right? Because presumably you're looking at both animals and the
Mm,
conservation of both, right? What is I guess how do you prevent them from almost bickering, right? Or like getting into each other's way and making sure that everyone's
yeah.
getting enough food, which I imagine is difficult because like you said, 30% of the forest gone. There's gonna be a lot of resource
Yeah.
competition that wasn't there before.
Completely. I mean, it's a challenge. I think like the way that we manage that the most is really through trying to get adequate habitat protection. Because in healthy forests that haven't been impacted by logging and land clearing, that haven't been cut down or like selectively cut down, in healthy forests, this kind of thing manages itself. Because you have enough resources for all of these animals to get what they need. Really advocating for good quality protection, good quality management, and where we need to intervene, restoration, that can sort a lot of that out. I've not seen greater gliders and koalas go head to head. I've been around both of them a lot. And typically, like, they tend to kind of, I think a lot of the time, they're kind of like sharing resources in a different way in the forest, because koalas don't require tree hollows, which is a major limiting factor for greater gliders. They can move both can move reasonably well, quite well actually. Koalas are, while they don't move much during the day, they're very mobile, particularly in the breeding season. Um, and so they can move around. Koalas have quite large home ranges. Greater gliders, relative to their body size, have fairly large home ranges. And so if the forest is there, it's not necessarily a case, at least between gliders and koalas, where you see direct competition where it's like nobody's getting enough food or they're fighting each other over the leaves. Like most healthy forests and forests like quite close to being like good healthy forest can account for both. What we see more bickering over for greater gliders, for example, is hollow availability. So I don't know how familiar you are with some of Australia's birds, but sulfur crested cockatoos, which are those like big kind of, I don't want to say scary, but like they've got an attitude. They're like white with this like yellow crest on their head. I've seen them boot a greater glider out of a hollow, like no worries. Greater gliders tend to be like, I don't want to say like bullied, but like if anyone's going to get kicked out of a hollow, it's going to be them, and they're going to get kicked out by most other species. So the food thing is probably less of an issue, but the hollow thing is definitely more of an issue. Like if you think about forests as like a bed and breakfast for most species, like the breakfast part is fine, the bed part, like some forests are going to be like no vacancy, sorry, or like it's going to be a bit of a like hostile type situation. So
And that's also why, like you were saying, the importance of putting back these boxes, right? Or just like providing them with
right,
nesting sites. Because if it's 100 years for the tree to be the appropriate size to have this, and now you're having competition over that with a bunch of with birds too and
yeah,
all these other species, right? How else are you going to counter that if not actually providing them their potential
some
nesting sites?
additional, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You mentioned that, there's the test site and then there's the control site where you're doing compare and contrast to
Mm,
see if something's working.
yeah.
How do you know when something's working? So like when you're going out, is it
Hmm.
just, because they won't call back, right? You mentioned that was one of the
Hmm.
difficulties. It's also not the appropriate time of day, right? Because it's at night, so you won't be able to see them. How are
Yeah.
you monitoring the environment to know that they're coming back and that you're making that positive impact?
So it is like working on this species is not one I recommend for like morning people. Like anyone who's like morning bird gets the worm, like forget about it. But I am luckily a night owl, and so all of our surveys take place at night. When it's dark, you're out in the forest. You'll have typically like a high-powered torch, sometimes thermal imaging equipment. Like I have thermal imaging binoculars. And so what we typically do to monitor whether or not what we're doing is having an impact and to what impact it's having is we go out and we do a spotlighting transect. So we basically have like it's about 1 kilometer that you're walking through the forest at night um, with your head torch, and what you're looking for, because they're not going to call back. You really want to just be like scanning the trees with your torch, looking for gliders. But what you're looking for, it's called eye shine. Like, have you ever like shone your torch or whatever, your dog, your cat, and it's like they're looking back at you with their glowy eyes? Um, Fun fact, that's called tapetum lucidum. It's like the part of your eye, of the back of their eye, that like refracts light around the eyeball. So that it's for like low light creatures, like sharks have the most amazing version of this. But anything that's operating in that low light environment, they have this really strongly. And so you're kind of out there shining your torch around looking for glowing eyes, basically. And so once you've found some glowing eyes, you can kind of like get your binoculars up and identify, well, is it a koala? Is it a greater glider? Is it an owl? Is it a yellow-bellied glider, sugar glider? Like, what is it? Once you've identified it, then you're typically recording everything that you see on that transect. And we are doing them, it's called double observer method, where like someone like myself, I'll walk through 10 minutes later, a second observer will walk through. And then at the end of the transect, we can compare, okay, what did you see? What did I see? Which ones did we both see in common? Which ones did we miss? that only one of us saw. And there's like a fairly simple algorithm that we can plug in that then is able to give us an estimate of abundance. And then also we can estimate like occupancy, like whether or not we're getting kind of like how many, like whether or not they're likely to be there and what factors are associated with them actually occurring at the site. And then for abundance, it's basically how many are there. And then we can kind of compare that between the sites as well. So for these kind of restoration works that we've done, particularly in the sites that were impacted by bushfires in New South Wales, some of our sites we've seen population numbers double at the nest box sites relative to the sites where we didn't do anything. So the sites where we didn't do anything, they're still recovering from the fires. They're still tracking well. It's still like hope making because we're like, okay, they're coming back slowly from the fires. So it's not all wrecked. But at the sites where we deployed the nest boxes, they're coming back twice as quick. So that kind of the fact that we've got higher numbers at the nest box, the fact nest box sites, the fact that we've got them in there quicker than when we've seen where we haven't done anything, it's stats like that that we're able to kind of track and monitor through time to be like, okay, yes, like what we're doing is making a difference.
That's really cool to I mean, you're seeing that you're making a difference, right? Like those number
Yeah,
that's
it's
that's not like a
amazing.
slight statistical difference, right? That's like we're
Yeah,
doubling
no,
it.
it's a lot.
At what
Yeah, it's
point
a lot.
at what point do you decide, hey, in this untouched zone, our control zone, like we're doing so much better in our experimental that we should do this here as well? Or do you tend to usually keep there to be touched and untouched just for the comparison reason?
It depends really on like timelines and funding, basically. So we like went out and did the nest box restoration at half the sites. We plan to keep monitoring. We're working with Australian National Uni to do a lot of the monitoring and research. Um, and so the longer we monitor for, the stronger those trends get, and the more conclusively we can say like this is not up to chance. These various different analyses show us that statistically this is a genuine thing that is significant. And so ideally for a lot of good programs, like you probably want to be doing that depending on how quickly you get individuals into nest boxes. You really want to be doing that for close to a handful of years. So maybe like 4 or 5 years could be enough for some sites, or could be less, or could be slightly more, depending on your landscape, to basically be able to say, like, yeah, this is really significant. We're doubling numbers. Having said that, we got gliders into these nest boxes really early, and that's been a really strong trend even in the first like 6 to 12 months. But in the first 6 to 12 months, because we don't have enough data points to say like this is statistically significant, we kind of need to keep collecting that data over time, over multiple years, to be able to confirm that that's the case and that's the story that the data is telling us. Um, but there's no reason why, like, it's now been 4 years, I believe, since we deployed the nest boxes. So, really, the only reason why we couldn't go back out and go, like, we know this works. We want to put nest boxes into these other sites to help that species recover in those sites as well. That really all comes down to funding. Because, like, to be able to build the nest boxes and then deploy them, like, they're deployed quite high up in the trees. So we have to climb and put them up and then put camera traps on them, that remote sensing cameras that are able to kind of also give us additional data for usage of the nest boxes. We need researchers to go out and do that monitoring. I'm only one person, so like we need many more people. So yeah, really it comes down to like there's so many parts of Australia that could benefit from these types among many other types of restoration, especially when we know it's working. But it really all comes down to like having the funding and the support to do that.
So you mentioned cameras also associated with these boxes. So is that a way that you can track those that moved in, I guess, right? When they moved in, can you tell based on those images, imagine like male or female? If how can you tell if they were having babies? Like, are you tracking that as well? Like, where are all these other extra data points also coming on in? And then just again, maybe a naive, silly question. Is there anyone else that moves into these boxes, or is there a way to keep it sugar glider or sorry, greater glider specific?
Yeah, good question. So the camera traps we're able to deploy on like a subset of the nest boxes. because the camera traps are reasonably expensive or just like an additional factor that we have to add on, like we kind of have to do a little bit of a like, do we build more nest boxes or do we buy camera traps for some of the nest boxes so that we can actually understand what's going on with the nest boxes? And so we try to like strike that balance where it's like we're mostly building nest boxes, but we've got a small subset that we monitor in a more kind of intensive way. And so, of that subset of nest boxes that we put camera traps on, we're able to see greater glider activity coming and going from the nest box. Um, you can't tell just by looking at a greater glider's like face or body necessarily that it's male or female. The males are typically a little bit bigger than the females, and obviously they have like testes, whereas the female has a pouch. So if you get a good look, or if it weirdly is like crawling over the camera or something, like maybe you could see it. But mostly how we've seen which sexes are going in and out of nest boxes is we've had the great privilege of seeing some females breed in the nest boxes. And so when when the young reaches a certain age, it rides around on mum's back. And before that, she'll leave it in the nest box. And so sometimes you'll see these gorgeous little like moments where she'll like come out of the nest box and then the baby will be like in the nest box, like kind of like looking out, and she'll be like, no, no, stay there. And then the baby like stays there and then she goes off and forages. And then when she comes back, the baby's just like, oh my God. And so it's like you get to see some of those moments. And like when it starts riding around on her back, you can see them both kind of like going out and the baby's just like hanging on for dear life. And so we've seen a few of those moments, which is really important and really amazing to see because greater gliders maintain a range of hollows. Like they don't just have one hollow that they use. The research kind of suggests they have anywhere from kind of half a dozen to a dozen, typically maybe around 8 to 10 different tree hollows that they're using at any given time. And we think that they cycle through those for thermoregulation. If one hollow is facing the sun and another hollow is on the other side of a tree on a hot day, maybe they'll go to the colder one. If they get booted out of one hollow by a cockatoo, then they'll go to the next closest hollow. So they've usually got like, quite a few on the go at any given time. And so typically they breed in the hollow that they prefer. So the fact that we had some breed in the nest boxes was really exciting because it's like, okay, we spent like 6 months, 9 months, like designing these greater glider specific nest boxes, which involved a whole lot of different prototypes and testing and, testing in the lab and then deploying into the field. And we were like, we've done everything we can. So like, hopefully you like it. And they loved it. So yeah, that's been really good. Your other question about whether or not other species are using the nest boxes, they absolutely are. But like I was just saying, like we design these nest boxes with greater gliders specifically in mind. Obviously, we're not opposed to like giving anybody else a leg up as well. Like these forests, particularly bushfire affected forests, like a lot of creatures need hollows. So like it's great that they're an additional resource that like any can theoretically use, but we did try to stack the odds in greater gliders' favor in a few different ways. So like the entrance of the nest box, we tried to tailor so that it would exclude some of the bigger species like brush-tailed possums. And where we deployed them in the tree was much higher than you typically deploy a nest box. So like most nest boxes deployed in the kind of like 8 to 10 meter range. And these ones we were deploying closer to like 18 to 20 meters because greater gliders typically are found much higher up in the tree canopy because they're trying to get up to all that foliage. So yeah, we kind of like had a few different ways that we were trying to like exclude other species or at least kind of like give greater gliders the greatest chance of getting to these boxes first. But we've had a whole range of like all kinds of species. We've had sugar gliders, feather-tailed gliders. We've had a range of different birds use them, possums, squeezing into them. Yeah, heaps of different kinds kind of using them. But for the site where they've doubled in numbers, there's multiple sites, but for that area, greater gliders are the species that are using the boxes more than any other species. So I think we did a pretty good job of like getting them in there as the first instance.
Yeah, would you mind, Kidda, going into a little bit about how the design process for these works? Because you mentioned also
Mm,
like field testing, lab testing, like for those, I don't know, I feel like this is really cool, right? You're building a custom box for this animal that you're trying to
yeah.
rescue and boost its numbers. What goes into that? What do you have to do to guarantee success? What do the tests look like so that you can again set it up for best chance of it actually working?
Yeah, it was very involved. So really the thing that we wanted to achieve, we had two key kind of design requirements in mind when we were designing these nest boxes for greater gliders. So the first one was really around thermal capabilities. So greater gliders are really sensitive to extreme temperatures, but particularly to like heat waves and warm temperatures. So over here, like anything that an overnight temperature of about like 20 degrees Celsius or greater is starting to get into the heat stress range, which isn't really that high. So we knew we wanted to design a nest box that could buffer them a little bit from the surrounding environment and the surrounding temperature, especially because the forest that we were deploying them into had been impacted by bushfires. And so a lot of the canopy cover and things that would otherwise give them some shade and protection from the sun and from areas warming up was gone at that time. So thermal kind of capacity of these nest boxes was a key thing for us. And then the size of the nest boxes, because before we'd kind of designed these nest boxes, and when I say we, like it was very collaboratively done. ANU did a whole bunch. We worked with some amazing men's sheds to build them. Um, Nobody had really had much success with getting greater gliders into nest boxes. And a lot of us had always suspected that it's because they weren't big enough in terms of like the size of the actual cavity or the box. So we wanted to design them as large as we could while still being able to hoist them and deploy them into a tree 20 meters up. We wanted to give them the best chance of being buffered from more extreme temperatures externally outside the boxes. And so what that looked like was really just working with different types of insulation in the boxes, foil boards, testing different like solar reflective kind of surfaces. Yeah, it was extremely involved.
That's cool that you mentioned too that you had that suspicion that the box needed to be bigger because it's taking on your active field work that you've experienced and then taking into account all the elements from the lab too. It's a really
Mm.
nice mix. How did you, what was the testing like? Like, how do you get a greater glider? Like, are they in the lab that you're working with, some of them on a day to day and you gave them like a choice and then you decided to put them into the field? Or is the only time that you're actually interacting with the greater glider is really just more in the wild and not in the lab setting? So it was more just trial and error of going out into the field.
Yeah, we didn't have them in the lab with us, unfortunately. I feel like that would have been really good. Not so good for them. I feel like they'd be somewhat stressed, but I would have loved to have done that trial and error. But basically, we were just working with proxies for what it might look like to have a glider in there. So we did a whole bunch of like crazy things, like we tested the boxes in a cold room and put a greater glider temperature hot water bottle inside the nest boxes, which we then put inside the cold room. And we measured how long it took for the heat from the hot water bottle to like get to a point where it would be like too cold for a greater glider. We also put they're called eye buttons. They're basically these little like temperature logger systems. We put those inside the nest boxes and then put the same nest boxes into a room and shone a really hot, bright lamp onto them to mimic like solar radiation from the sun and to look at how long they took to heat up to a danger kind of level for the inside of the box. And then we also put them in these climate chambers. It's basically this like really fancy kind of box system that we can program to basically be like, okay, under climate change conditions, we want to cycle through like a heat wave day where the start temperature is this and the top peak temperature at like midday or whenever it's going to be hottest is going to be this, and then the overnight temperature is going to be this. And we'll do that over 48 hours or 72 hours and see how long it takes for the box to heat up to a point that would be dangerous for a greater glider. And then we continue measuring to look at how long it takes that same box to lose the heat that it's picked up till it comes back down to that like safe zone for a greater glider. And so we did that across, it was probably 6 different nest box designs to look at which one performed best. And with different elements like if we insulate all sides without the roof and without the floor, what does that do? If we insulate 3 sides plus the roof, what does that do? If we include solar reflective paint, does that help us? So it was just kind of like cycling through a whole bunch of different design elements to see which one would give us as close to the results that we could possibly get. We were putting out a nest box that we knew wasn't going to be a death trap for a greater glider to go into on a hot day, and that they're more likely to go into just because of the size, dimensions, and design.
How hard is it to predict what a hot day is going to be, right? Because you mentioned climate change and there's like these
Yeah,
fluctuations that make it very unpredictable, right? As much as like the regular person can look at it and be like, well, it's not supposed to be this hot right now. And then, you'll
yeah.
get different peaks. How hard is it to buffer those potential changes that are unpredictable into these models
Mm.
and into the boxes as well? Because that seems kind of scary, right? Of like, it's
Yeah,
perfect, it
it
perfectly
is.
buffered for this range, but like,
Mm-hmm.
what if it's 10 degrees hotter all of a sudden one day? Will it then roast them, right? It's like, how do
Yeah.
you account for and plan for this very unpredictable part?
So, I mean, there's 2 things. I think the main thing that we were coming into it with the knowledge of is one really hot day, or even 2 really hot days, or even 3 really hot days is probably okay. But if the temperature doesn't drop down overnight, that's when we're in a lot of trouble. And so, like, we can do the best that we can with these designs to buffer them for the extreme heat with a fluctuation of 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. Like we can do a lot if we know it's just going to be like a really hot day or a couple of really hot days. It's we can't do much if we know that the overnight temperatures remain high, and that goes for any tree hollows, whether they're nest boxes or whether they're natural tree hollows. Natural tree hollows are obviously going to be the best at buffering them from all of these things because it's a living organism. The tree is able to shed heat really amazingly once it's starting to cool down. It's got the canopy and everything else. Like it's a highly vascularized plant that is really good at regulating its own temperature in a lot of ways as well, particularly in those ambient environments. But there's only so much that we can do. And so with climate change, like we are trying to build habitat structures that are going to give them the best chance. But aside from like, we know that we've built something that's going to buffer them when the weather gets hot, probably for about 48 hours, 48 to 72 hours. And if that's not enough, then we have to assume that a greater glider will move to a different hollow. Kind of like I was saying, we know they maintain multiple hollows. And so if it starts to get too hot in the nest box, we would hope that it would move. But I work as a climate adaptation ecologist at WWF, and so part of my role beyond doing these on-ground projects and throwing lifelines to these vulnerable species is a lot of the work that we do to try to get meaningful action on climate change as well, and making sure that, like, yes, we're doing the stuff on the ground, but then we're also all working together to have like a habitable planet for us and for gliders when it comes to kind of actually taking action on climate change. So I think factoring climate change into the work looks like a lot of different facets, and it's like really good design that factors that into the restoration work, but it's also kind of the advocacy stuff that we do as well.
How difficult is the advocacy for public buy-in when it comes to greater gliders? So we've talked with other conservationists in the US, right? And it's a lot of, you have to get these people on side and these people on side and these people on side for a different reason, right? Is it any different for the greater glider in Australia? Do you find it to be like, is there pretty quick public buy-in? Are they considered pests? Is there pride behind the animal? What kind of different peoples do you have to deal with when doing these projects? Just like a little
Mm.
bit, take us through some of the, I'd love to hear about some of that difference there.
Yeah, I think they're a pretty easy species to get behind. Relative to koalas, like I was in the koala world for a while, that's definitely a more spicy, interesting, challenging space to try to navigate because their conservation status is um, a little bit all over the place in terms of like in New South Wales and Queensland, they're an endangered species, but in Victoria, where I'm from, in South Australia, they're considered not an endangered species, and there are some areas where they're considered overabundant, like there's too many, and so it's very difficult with all these different kind of conservation challenges right across their range, and koalas just make people go crazy. So you know, there's that. But greater gliders, I haven't noticed as much of that. I kind of feel like everybody is low key team greater glider. Um, I think there's a lot of people who are trying to do a lot of good things in the forest conservation and advocacy space. Um, I feel like there's been a big rise in people working on greater gliders, particularly since like the bushfires and probably over the last like handful of years, which has been really great to see. Um, yeah, it's a challenging space. I think that where it becomes most challenging, I think, is just where it clashes or butts up against with like industry. So native forest logging is like a big issue for greater gliders. It's a significant, if not the most significant, contributing factor to their demise. And so we're often having those challenging interactions and discussions with industry to try to navigate that. So that's probably where the most like clash or tension often happens. Beyond that, probably what's been like this another challenging factor is just like up until recently, I feel like most people, like the average Australian, didn't even know what a greater glider was. Like most everybody knows what a koala is. Most people know about gliders generally, but I think typically they're often thinking about like sugar gliders or things that they are more likely to see. Um, but yeah, the last few years it's definitely been a lot of work in the like education space and getting people kind of interested in this species space and just kind of like singing their praises across like more public platforms for people to kind of fall in love with this species. But inevitably, whenever that's done well and whenever people feel like they have an opportunity to connect with the species, I've never seen it go wrong. I've never seen anybody like talk about them like pests or anything like that. Like they're absolutely not. And people, given the opportunity, I've seen everybody fall in love with this species.
If you had, like, if I told you, Dr. Kidda, please give us the reason why I should love this animal. Like, beyond the fact that it's an animal that lives on our planet that we're sharing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the fact that you and I, as naturalists, would love, what is a good sales pitch as to why people should know about this animal and really be supporting its resurgence?
It's a good question. It would depend on who was asking me this question. So if you were asking me this question, which you are, I would say that the main reason to get behind greater glider conservation and to support it is because they are one of the better flagship species for forests and for these habitats and places that we all love to go and look at and hike through and camp in. And, they're the places that really, I don't know about you, but like for me, I feel most alive when I'm like out in the forest and I'm out in these places that like you appreciate because of every other species, plant and animal that's in that place. And so greater gliders, because they are reliant upon tall, mature, big green eucalypt trees that have hollows in them that take a long time to form. They're an amazing species for if we protect greater gliders, we protect so many other species. Like the last analysis that I did that was looking at for all of the threatened species that are listed as a federally listed threatened species, like how many of those share habitat with greater gliders? It was 808 other species. So my pitch would be like, if you love birds, if you love mammals, if you love bugs, if you love ferns, if you love trees, like whatever it is that you love, if you're into forest, then like this is the species for you. Because if we look after them, we're looking after all of that.
I love that. Now, there's one thing that you mentioned earlier where I was just like, oh, we please have to get back to this because this just seems like it's gonna throw such a wrench into everything. Multiple
Right.
species.
Oh my God. Yeah. I thought you
So
were going to say this.
I got so curious by the prospect of it too that you're mentioning there that there's at least two, there's maybe up to four. How
Yeah.
on earth do you treat that? Because I know, at least in the US, right, if you end up having a different delineation, like there's, instead of one species, there's four, then the numbers are different too, and
Mm,
it's easier to justify
hmm.
legally to protect them, right? I assume that's
Correct.
similar over there as well. But how do
Yeah.
you do then? Like we just went over how difficult the counting is for the just standard greater glider one. Now it's greater
Yes.
glider four. And
Yeah.
like, why do we think there's multiple? What's separating them in terms of is it geography? Is it the genetic side
Mm.
of things? And then how are you able, if at all, to be able to get some of that delineation and get some of those numbers?
So, yeah, great questions. Taxonomy is like so useful and so needed, but also can be so challenging at times. So really, Denise McGregor, an amazing researcher at ANU, led a genetic investigation into greater gliders, and she had kind of looked at like what was going on genetically across the species. And there's been a bunch of other research around that from a few other crew, kind of looking at, well, genetically, what do we got here? And at the moment, the federal government recognizes that there's at least two species, when not that long ago, only a few years ago, it was only one that was recognized. So at the moment, we now have the northern greater glider, which is a smaller population, that's kind of up around Queensland. And then we have the southern greater glider, which goes from kind of like southern Queensland down New South Wales and into Victoria. Um, but within that, yeah, we think that there's potentially at least like there could be three and there could be as many as five different species. But as you've alluded to, as we've already talked about, like getting those genetic samples is extremely challenging. And so, like, that's really been what's held up further kind of delineation taxonomically of what's going on with the actual genetics behind the species. So we can get genetics a few different ways. For this species, it's usually either scats, so like looking at their poop, or it's tissue samples. So like taking a small tissue sample, typically from ears, when we're capturing them, but we're not capturing them very often. Like we've caught a bunch of them. I myself have caught a bunch of them previously when we've done home range studies, putting small GPS collars on them and looking at where they're going, how often they're moving, what factors are influencing their movements or prohibiting their movements. And so studies like that give you an opportunity to kind of collect samples, but otherwise they're an extremely difficult species to get genetic samples from. And so that's mostly been what's held things up. And from a like what's creating that different genetic kind of delineation, like it's a range of factors, but there's some geography behind it, obviously, with barriers to their genetic movement. And then there's also kind of like connectivity stuff, there's climate stuff in there, but really we've kind of like just dipped our toe in the water when it comes to what's going on genetically with these species. So it is a really interesting part.
I'm a geneticist, so like hearing
Okay, yeah, you are.
the delineations, it's just like it's always something that seems really difficult to balance out when it comes
Mm,
to the conservation numbers to it, when it comes to defining who's who for conservation reasons, but
yeah.
then taxonomy reasons and the tracking. It's just a very complicated picture, right, that you're already having to deal with. What would you say is not maybe day to day like, but month to month like? What are some of those things that you're actively needing to do when it comes to this kind of conservation work? Because we've heard everything from, walking across jungles and having to do manual counts, right? To have, for you,
Mhm.
like you're going out at night, right? Which already seems kind of
Yeah.
scary in the Australian wilderness, given all that we know. What are some
Mm.
of those challenges that folks at home probably don't realize that goes into this kind of conservation work?
I mean, it's pretty relentless, to be honest. Um, I feel like it's a privilege, of course, but being a threatened species and climate adaptation ecologist while we're all marinating in like an extinction crisis and a climate crisis, like it is relentless. But on a day-to-day level, like this morning I just finished writing a letter to a minister with a whole range of other groups that are trying to ask for a patch of forest to not get logged because we know that's going to have a significant impact on greater gliders. Um, so there's a lot of like policy work there and a lot of that public facing stuff. Next week, I'll be heading out to do some surveys in that patch of forest to try to find more greater glider hollows and more greater glider records because when we find their hollows, they get a 50-meter protection zone put around that hollow. So the more of those hollows that we can find, the more of their habitat that gets protected, particularly in the strongholds and the areas that are refuges for them under climate change. So yeah, next week I'll be out in the field doing that. I've got a paper in review with my colleagues about basically everything greater gliders. Like it's like a full life history kind of study, looking at all the different facets of greater gliders across the different taxonomic groups. So that's going through peer review at the moment. So it's typically like in the lead up to that, that was like a lot of editing and a lot of writing. Yeah, it's day to day, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but greater gliders are not the only species that I work on. So I also work on a range of other threatened species. So it's kind of finding a bit of a balance. Between all the species while still keeping up with the relentless pace of trying to like fight back against the climate and extinction crisis.
It definitely, so the theme of our interview series, Kit, I feel like has been every one of the guests that we've had on has, including yourself, has been a superhero of sorts because of just so much stuff that needs to be done to ensure the survival of just one of these species, right? Like you're the field
Mm,
researcher, you're working on the governmental side of things, you're working on the like the local population and like for you education and buy-in of what this animal even is, that it exists. Like
yeah.
it that relentlessness and the fact that you can keep going is a true testament of just how incredible y'all are as the conservationists leading the line here for support of these animals. What is it that keeps you going? Like you just mentioned, it's relentless, like climate change,
Mm,
extinction level events, political
mm.
changes, and yet you're on the front lines. You're just, going out next week and going doing the field work and publishing papers. And what is it that keeps you going as we're rounding out our discussion today? The kind of the inspirational message for folks at home to also think back on and reflect.
First of all, that's super kind of you to say. You know, what keeps me going? I think like I just, without being like, I feel a crushing sense of responsibility. That's what keeps me going. But beyond that, like, I have this, I was talking to my partner about this the other day. I have this feeling where I'm kind of just like, in a somewhat freeing way, like every single day I wake up and I try my best. And I know that like pretty much every single day I'm going to fail. But when I'm in the shower at night or like brushing my teeth and just like, having those quiet moments where I'm like just like looking myself in the eye, like brushing my teeth, um, I can feel a certain sense of peace knowing that I've tried my best. And sometimes that's all you can do. And for different folks, whatever that spark inside you is for, whether it's for forests and gliders, whether it's for social justice and whether it's like whatever that thing is that makes your heart feel both like big and heavy. Like, if you can honestly say to yourself at the end of most days, I did the best that I can do, then like to me, that's just like how I go to sleep at night, where I'm just like, I know it's never enough, but it's the best that I can do. And I believe that like if more people do that and the more and more people that live that way that are just like I'm doing the best I can, then one day it will be enough. Because like one person alone is not going to be able to solve it. One person alone, like myself, is going to be like, well, today I got up and failed, but like at least I tried, you know? Um, so I think there's like a certain like don't take it too seriously, have a certain amount of humility to it, but just try to be as authentic as you can in just being like, I tried today. And like that's all you can do. And that's the best that we any of us can do.
You are absolutely the right person to be in this position. Oh my, like that is just such a beautiful answer. I'm just in awe. The whole chat too is like, oh my God, like that is a beautiful. That's the person we want leading this. Um,
Oh, thanks.
I, as we're rounding out our hour, I just really want to thank you for your time today and your expertise. I mean, that hour flew by. I had so much
It
fun.
did.
Yeah, about learning like what you do and how you do, and it's still just like, what an incredible animal and what an incredible effort that y'all are leading the charge on. And I just truly, for that experiences that you share with us today, for the mindset of how you keep that positive mentality and just all the work that you do for saving species. Like truly, truly thank you. Is there, as we're closing out, kind of a rounding message for what folks can do at home to further support uh the greater glider, but also just other Australian animals? Like we over in the US, if we're really loving the Australian animals, what can we do? As I one more
Mm.
time, hopefully just
Oh,
unfreeze
I
our
didn't even clock
camera.
that one. I
I
was like deep into like thinking about what you're asking me.
I
There's a whole bunch of things people can do. I think like if you're specifically motivated by Australian animals and Australian ecosystems, um, there's a whole range of organizations that you can support in various different ways. So first of all, for people who are like in a position for supporting financially, obviously that's always an option. But like a lot of people are not in that position right now, given everything that's going on in the world. Um, so other ways that you can support is like as simple as just like talking to friends and family about it. Like, hey, I like was part of this like live stream today and like they were talking about this thing. Did you know about a greater glider? Or like get on the socials and like feel free to look me up or look WWF up. And like there's a whole lot of just like spreading awareness. And it sounds like it, oh, you know, what difference is that going to make? But like growing the public profile for this species and for a lot of other Australian species always helps. So there's those kinds of two things that I think are quite simple, just from a high level. But like on an individual level, like there's so many things that people can be doing that supports their patch and their backyard and species that might be close to them that by extension also supports like globally what we're facing as far as climate and extinction goes. So like there's some small, like pretty simple, like quietly rebellious things that you can do, like eat lots of plants. Like I don't care like what your diet looks like, but like the more plants you can eat, like the better that is for the planet. Like join your local library, like the more that you can get involved in like community stuff and supporting community folks, like it's little things like that where like we're living in a time where everybody is so incredibly disconnected even though we're more like connected than we've ever been. So things that you can do to like really step back into your community at that local level. I know it seems like it's only going to make a difference to you, but it doesn't. Like it absolutely has a ripple effect. And the more people that come together and like can grow plants and have a veggie patch if you have options to do that, or join your local like if you have like a community garden, you join that too. Like, and I'm talking a lot about like gardening, but like I just think that the more people can get in touch with nature and get their hands dirty, get dirt under your nails, like that'll make you feel better. It'll make you feel connected. Um, and it genuinely does make a difference with like just feeling hopeful and, taking some of the pressure off like food systems. And yeah, I think there's like simple things that you can do to like dial into your local community that make a difference to you, but make a difference to us over here as well.
I love that. Dr. Kidda, thank you again for your time today, for your words of wisdom,
Thanks for having
for
me.
your experience, and just thank you for leading the charge over there. We appreciate
We're all
everything you
doing
do.
what we can. That's all we're doing, right?
And right, every day, just trying your best, like you said.
Just do your best. That's all you can do.
We appreciate you.
Awesome.
Have a wonderful day, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
all
online as
all
well.
genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us.